is that the moment where you freeze it into time and, you know,
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the things I mentioned in the book, and like sort of one of my jams in general, is that we treat the Homeric poems as if they come at the beginning of traditions, which is probably true for us, right? But in their own context, they mark the end of it.
who controls the myths and narratives? Are there people creating these stories that impact human culture and collective identity and history? Or do these stories have agency of their own? In today's podcast, we will imagine myths as biological organisms, parasites and viruses which can evolve, heal, or harm. Hello, my name is Anya Leonard, and you are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Our guest today is Joel Christensen, professor in the Department of Classical and Early Mediterranean Studies at Brandeis University, where he also serves as Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs. He is the author of many books, including The Many-Minded Man, The Odyssey, Psychology, and the Therapy of Epic, and the recently released Storylife, on epic, narrative, and living things, of which we'll speak about today. But before we delve into determinism versus free will, generative AI, and the incompatibility of heroes and families, a quick shout out to our Classical Wisdom members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to learn more about classical wisdom, including our free newsletter, please go to classicalwisdom.substack.com and check it out. So, Joel, thank you so much for joining me today. And, I always really enjoy reading your books because they seem very non-intuitive at first. And so you kind of have to do a little bit of work to get the premise, but then it's so rewarding when you do. So, because then they kind of stick with you more because you had to think about them. And so this is one I think that follows that tradition nicely.
Yeah.
And because even the name, Storylife, you hear the name and you're like, okay, what's this going to be about? And then epic, narrative, and living things. So already in the
Yeah.
title, you're kind of got a few things that you're going to work with. Maybe just to start us off, sort of your premise of how do we apply a biological analogy to Homer and the
Mm.
myths?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the title first, so I'll talk about it. Because the original title, like when it was in manuscript and proposal form, was Epic Virus, which is a terrible title.
Oh, I like
But
it. I like epic
well, no,
virus.
I felt like it was too much, and it too hard hitting on one theme of the book. So I ended up saying Story Life for a couple reasons. Right. One is like there's a weak form of the general argument I make in the book, and the weak form is that language and narrative functions like a living thing, and it's beneficial to think of it that way. The strong form, which may seem as too mystical or even strange, is that narrative is actually alive. And or it is so close to being alive that we should actually treat it that way, because it would help us engage with it better. And so that's sort of the end point. And I think a fundamental question there is like, why does Homer matter for this? And why do biological analogies matter? And so the book is organized around a series of biological analogies. And the first starting point is that we should treat semantics and morphology of language the way we think of DNA. And there are two reasons for this. One, on the side of meaning, meaning doesn't exist outside or independent of a context, right? Like an ecosystem that triggers certain responses in DNA. So that's one. On the other side, it's really an implicit argument against authorship and thinking too much about creativity and genius of the author and thinking more about the structures of language and story that make it possible for a story to develop collectively. And so Homer's a good test case for this because Homeric language is formulaic, because we have a good indication of a tradition that is about oral composition, and performance, and because Homeric studies have been engaged for so long with struggling over like the author idea. And so the beginning, it's about structure, and how understanding the structures of Homeric poetry as being akin to, let's say, singular cellular life that then combines into multicellular organisms helps us to see that, you know, things like doublets, triplets, ring composition helps to functions to facilitate the building of larger corporate structures without necessarily having a plan, but that audiences can receive it in a way in which it's structured because it's connected in part to also the way we create meaning. So the first two chapters really go through that to different extents, and then the last three chapters use different metaphors to address sort of different problems of stories and where they come from and what they do. So in the sort of middle chapter,
Can I pause you though, because I want to
yeah.
delve into those in due time. I think
Okay.
if we kind of do too much right at once, you'll scare the folks away.
Always,
The
always a problem with me.
no, because I think this is fascinating, and I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. So when you say the sort of narrative has a life of its own,
Mm.
I think does that sort of just apply to sort of oral tradition myths that are kind of collectively created, or I can imagine there's somebody who's an author or a writer in the audience who's kind of bristling and like, wait, no,
Yeah,
I have
my
more
ideas
control
are
over
my
here.
own.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, so two things. So let me go to the strongest possible articulation of it, which is that yes, authors aren't responsible for their work, which I don't fully believe, and I can use a Homeric analogy for that too. But we're conditioned both culturally and biologically to think of ourselves in isolation as individuals. Right? We think of our skins as barriers against the world. But we know intellectually that that's not true at all, right? Our skins permeable, our bodies are dependent on other creatures, right? Other people, and our minds are as well. We don't think enough about sort of group minds and collective minds and how we influence each other on, you know, even hormonal levels, but also on thought levels, right? And so I always use a simple analogy if I'm in a room with a painting, and I say, look at that painting, right? An individual painted it. We know this, right? But the painting itself has a history to it, the craft, the aesthetics that shape it, the conversation that this painting is in with other paintings and other situations. And so the question is, what do we credit more, right? An individual's choice to make individual selections in making this painting, or the tradition that helped to shape it. And so we, especially in the West and the US, overemphasize individual contribution as opposed to collective. So part, it's a corrective to get us thinking about that. You know, art, whether it's writing, song, or visual, doesn't come out of a vacuum. It's part of a conversation. And as human beings, we're really poor at seeing and thinking in the aggregate and how everything sets up to make it possible to create this work of art. And to go back, partly why I think that this is also appropriate to Homer is in the Odyssey. There's this lament from Zeus, line 31 of book one, where he complains. It says, "Mortals are always blaming us for their fate when they make it worse than it had to be because of their own recklessness." And this is a strong statement in the beginning of the Odyssey, asking us to think about determinism and agency. Right? What is the balance between what we're given and what we do and choose in the world? And how does this relate to what actually ends up happening? And so I think that's a longer answer, I think, to the question, which is we are steeped in the idea of individualism and individual agency. To really think about how narrative and art functions in the world, we need to look on the other side. Now, apart from that, the larger thing is like all you need to do is see what happens to conspiracy theories online to see quickly how rapidly stories change without having to attribute to a single person. And that what we too often emphasize is who's in charge of this narrative. What we should be thinking about is why do people receive the narrative and what impact does it have on the world? Because we can't always resolve origins, right? But we can observe effect.
So it's almost like, who accepts the myth is more with regards to who creates the myth, because the myth has to
Absolutely.
perpetuate it. And I like how I thought we would just be talking about the evolution of myth, and we've gone straight into free will versus determinism. Big
Yeah.
picture questions.
Right.
Uh, you would also think that there would be perhaps a spectrum of art that is created more collectively versus individually. And you
Sure.
think of like Euripides, I mean, the tradition of him being a recluse in a cave or something, writing his sort of
Yeah.
twisted
Well,
tales.
well, I think, when it comes to individual pieces of art, right, what I always, the way I think about it is that we all receive a shared language, right? But what makes, let's say, individual poets remarkable, memorable, is the extent to which they push the boundaries on the formula, the extent to which they push language and our expectations to the point where it's almost something new. Right. I think about this a lot. The example I use with my kids is dissonance in music, right? Sometimes you get right to the point where the harmonies fall apart, but then you pull it back, right? Without the notion of harmony in the tradition of other songs, that wouldn't work. And so I think part of what is remarkable about the Iliad and the Odyssey is the way they work within a tradition, but push it to absurd boundaries of length and meaning that often surprises people. And I think the question for Homerists, which is not a new question, but I think a critical one, is whether we credit the value of the tradition and its final form to many generations that put it in a position for that to be created, or to whomever was in charge for bringing that last form together. My feelings are pretty clear. Like, I think it's the tradition that should be valued. But on the same token, we need to recognize that there's always a tension, a productive tension between an individual actualization of a thing and the history that makes it possible.
So is it almost like a discredit to the living myth when Homer puts it pen to papyrus? Like, is that the moment where you freeze it into time and you know
Absolutely. So one of the things I mentioned in the book, and like sort of one of my jams in general, is that we treat the Homeric poems as if they come at the beginning of traditions, which is probably true for us, right? But in their own context, they mark the end of it, right? By fossilizing it, by stopping it. And I think they're also super conscious of their own position at the end of the myth. And so we too often think, oh, the Homeric poems present the authoritative version of a story. And to students, I always say, no, they're weird, right? We shouldn't think of them as authoritative for the ancient audiences. They may be for us because of the position they have in the tradition. And that's one way in which my own thinking and teaching has changed over the past 5 to 10 years. Because I think those of us who are really into the oral formulaic studies and the oralist tradition of Homer often discredit too much that people had different ideas about the text and treated it that way, right? From Aristotle on, people thought this is a single text with a singular author, and they edited the text that way, they commented it on that way. And so it's one thing to perform a corrective and say, well, actually the text came from somewhere else, but we can't completely ignore like 2,000 years of interpretation and response.
Yeah, and I think it's always important to remind people who might not know or remember clearly that, the Homeric epics are just sort of one slice of a much larger Trojan myth cycle
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
we don't sadly have all of those works, or
Right.
we have
Well,
references to them, but
or all the other epics, right?
yeah.
So another thing I'll say is, we have, I think we tend to think we have a lot of epic because of its size, but we have 30,000 lines plus some more, which is a lot. But if we compare the numbers to extant tragedy and what we know we lost from tragedy, right? We have 36 some odd plays in full from Athenian tragedy. But we have titles for over 900 plays.
Yeah. Oh,
And so we can imagine that and that's just 100 years. So in 100 years, 1,000 plays, we have 3.6% of them. right? I think we have to imagine at the very least that like the epic tradition had a similar proportion of survival, compared to old extant texts, which means again we can't assume we have everything. We have a little bit of it, and a bit of it that may not actually have been standard in ancient performances.
Well, and I mean, you think of somebody like Sappho, which of course is we've lost the vast majority of her work,
Yeah,
and a lot of times, as you say, the things that have been preserved are the things that were unusual. Like this is a
yeah.
weird word, let's put it in a rare dictionary, and
Right.
like that's
Yeah,
the only
yeah,
thing we have.
yeah.
So maybe the things that survive are sometimes the abnormalities. So if these stories sort of have an agency of their own,
Mm.
and I think your example of sort of online rumors, what are the implications of that? Like, how should we understand myth then?
Well, the analogy that I use in chapters 4 and 5 is the analogy from symbiosis. So symbiosis is when we live with other life forms, and it's not all bad, right? So we have up to 8% of non-human DNA in our bodies. Some of it comes from endogenous retroviruses, which actually made it possible for placental implantation in mammals. So we're messes to begin with, right? But so there's mutualism, which is when you live with something, a virus or another animal that makes you healthy in some way or helps you. And then parasitism hurts you, right? These are what viruses do, ringworm, all those things. But some relationships can change, like any human relationship, right? But symbiosis can go from being bad to harmful to beneficial, beneficial to harmful. And so when it comes to stories, one thing most people who write about narrative, is that stories are extremely beneficial, right? Whether you're looking at the work of like Yuval Harari or evolutionary psychologists, human organization relies on our ability to tell stories, which leads to notions of belonging and mission, creates entire ideas of culture and cultural groups. Story is actually an amazing technology that comes before fire. Right. It is maybe the most important human technology. On the other hand, we can't think of it just as a purely good thing because stories can be used to bad ends and unintentional ends, right? They can have dysfunctional effects on us, make us believe bad things. Stories and the stories we tell about ourselves can lead to severe psychological malfunction, if we want to think of it that way. And so when you look at story, not at both an individual level, people believe terrible things about the world and themselves, or at a cultural level, it can get us to move together, but it can also make us move apart. And so, the example, or the way I really deeply started to think about it, was during the COVID era, which we're still in, but during the height of it, just the way people responded to narratives about the virus. The way bad advice was taken up as good advice, the way we junked science and thought about injecting bleach, all of those things made me realize like we don't have control over narratives, especially conspiracy theories, but positive narratives. And that no matter how complicated our understanding of science gets, if we can't articulate what it means in the world and why we should believe these things and advantages, if we can't situate the human being in a world of technology, then we're not going to be able to meet challenges like climate change, like income inequality, like many of the things that we're facing, because we can't actually control the narrative.
Just to kind of go back a little bit to show sort of ancient examples of how narratives can be very harmful. I like to think a lot of times of both the story of Medea. You think
Mhm.
the original Corinthian traditions, like she doesn't kill her own children. It's not till Euripides, from his
Yeah,
reclusive, non-social cave, decides to make her much more evil. But also, the story of Orestes and the House of Atreus, that whole tradition, I find the Athenian playwrights sort of rewrote a lot of the roles where then that result in the marginalization of Athenian women. In
absolutely.
that, you have at the end of the Orestes, being chased by the Furies because he's killed his mother. And, just to recap very quickly for our audience, he's being chased with these Furies because he's avenged his father by killing his mother. And then it kind of ends with this Deus Ex Machina with Athena, the goddess, sort of determining whether matricide is valid with regards to honoring your
Yeah.
father. And she comes to the conclusion that because she was born out of her father's head, that fathers are more important than mothers when it comes to
Right.
childbirth.
I love that example, and I'll add another one, and then we can think about like what it means. And the simpler one I always use in a myth class is Clytemnestra's agency in the killing of Agamemnon, right? In the Odyssey, it's pretty clear she didn't kill him, right? It's Aegisthus, and so she's just sort of a an unvirtuous, unfaithful handmaiden to murder.
Yeah.
But in
She's not.
Aeschylus's play,
Yeah.
yeah, in Aeschylus's play, she's axing him in the bathtub, right? And so the question is, right, is that choice made by Aeschylus to reflect the values and beliefs of Athenians or to impact them? And we
Yeah.
can't possibly know because it's a conversation between the what we'll call the narrative ecosystem of Athens and that element of story, right? And so that's in stories like that. I think of like the story of Orestes as a DNA strand, right? And in different environments, different parts of it are activated in different ways. And so that one, you're right, it's a virulent type of misogyny that's being activated on the Athenian stage by giving a woman agency. And the question for me is like, do we see Euripides, Sophocles, and Aeschylus as making this choice because they want to affect a different belief, or as reflecting the beliefs of their time and massaging the stories differently for their audiences?
We really need those other 850 odd whatever
Right, right.
plays to determine this a bit more. But yeah, I mean, or perhaps in between, they're just reinforcing, like they're not causing, they're not just a passive reflection, but they're kind of
Yeah. Well, and you could
enabling.
see that. I mean, just with like the Orestes and Electra pair, right? Like we fortunately have Sophocles, Agamemnon, and Aeschylus. So yeah, sorry, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides all talking about them, and they play off each other's performances, right? They sort of mock each other or build off of it, and so yeah, they're definitely interacting and responding. But the question is like, where do we credit the choice? Right. And so I'm always thinking like, looking at the total context, what's the impact? And where does this come from? But I think that the Resties example is perfect. I'm glad you brought
Okay,
that
to
up.
go back to sort of the heart of both your work and your years of study, as well as the premise of the book. So you're using Homer as sort of your your basis for this analogy, because he's so formulaic. Can Homer be extrapolated to other narratives and myths? I mean, does it work for everybody?
Yeah.
Is Homer a bit unique? How much information can we use from just
Well,
Homer?
so yeah, and that's the slippage in my argument. I think fewer people, not everyone, will find persuasive. Is that Homer's a great test case, but that the elements within it apply elsewhere, right? And so Homeric language. So the first core of the argument is about the formulaicness of Homeric language and that it is amenable to a structural interpretation that's similar to multicellular life. But the elements of themes and motifs and engagement with the audience is something that applies all the way around. So one thing I would say is, look, a test case that people might find persuasive is to look at comic book narratives from the 20th century, right? And how Batman and Superman respond both to each other, but also to the events in the world, and how the superhero narratives change, right? When we move from fighting fascism to suddenly we're in the nuclear age, we're in the civil rights period. It changes the stories that people are telling, because audiences are interested in different things. right? And so, you know, you can pick up a comic book and say, well, that guy's the author, but then the people who are doing the drawing, the painting, like there's an entire committee involved, and the impact that these stories have on people is, you know, I'm not going to say it's equal to Homer, but in some individual lives, it is. And so, one of the things I do in the book, though, is I say, well, let's look at a few other authors. So I do look at Sappho. In one, I look at Sappho fragment 16 to show a correlation between the structure of the poem and what we know from cognitive studies in literature about how literature engages with the brain. But I then also talk about in the third chapter, I go from the Gilgamesh epics to the folk singer John Prine. To look at different motifs and how they may look similar, but they're also responding to their time. So I think if you have enough data, you can perform similar moves from most art forms. Because again, what you're looking at is what are the restrictions of a genre, of a type, right? What are repeated motifs? And how does it influence the way people create art? Right. There was an article, I think just last week's New Yorker or the one before called Love and Theft. And it's about plagiarism accusations in romantasy novels. I didn't even know this was a genre, but you know, it's fantasy and romance together. And there are a couple paragraphs talking about different generic types, about subtypes of genres, motifs, and tropes. And I was immediately reading it, texting my Homerist friend saying, you need to read this article about romance because it says a lot about myth and Homer. And I think they thought I was on drugs on that one. But again, like it's all about like what we judge as the individual contribution versus the cultural one. And I think you can take almost any narrative art form and look at that balance and ask the question of, you know, what makes the differences important to the time and place, and then think about the causality and what brought them to bear.
These narrative structures can work in common across cultures. So, I mean, is there any similarities between heroic myths that can tell us about human psychology? I mean, and I know this is sort of Joseph Campbell and the archetypes. I mean, do some of those ideas still hold up, or are they kind of under question?
Well, let's see, which way should it? One, I mean, I think heroic myth, following the pattern that Campbell and others have identified, is extremely effective because it echoes our experience up through adolescence and into adulthood. Right? This is the sort of Jungian, Freudian family drama approach. But really the pattern is like awakening into early adulthood, not feeling like you belong anywhere, struggling through adolescence, and then returning to community like through marriage and everything. Right? My problem with the way it's set up and the way that we've activated in the modern world is that this pattern says nothing about like how to raise children, like how to be a good spouse, like how to age and be part of a community, right? And so I think what has happened with heroic myth in the modern world is that because it's not being told in a traditional setting, we don't understand that it's also full of warnings, and that heroic myth is actually supposed to warn us against being too extraordinary and exceptional, right? And so I'll just give quick examples. The basic premise of the Heracles myth, apart from he has to do these labors, is that he's dangerous, right? He kills his first wife and children, Megara and his first wife, and then his second wife or last wife, Deianira, kills him. And so there's a central repetition in heroic myth that heroes can't be part of families. Right. And that's what you learn, is that we can't be like heroes. They're dangerous. And a second thing, and so this is where I get really frustrated with renewed calls to teach epic in the United States and in UK, is that Achilles and Odysseus aren't people to be looked up to. They're dangerous examples because heroes suffer and cause suffering. It's a central thing. Like from the beginning of the Iliad, we're told Achilles brings myriad Achaeans to their doom, right? He prays for his own people to die, and Patroclus dies as a result of that request, right? That's a central message of the Iliad, right? Odysseus, like the opening of the Odyssey, is like, hey, this guy tried really hard to bring his companions home, but he failed. And it suggests at the beginning it was their fault. But then if you read the Odyssey really carefully, like Odysseus is a pretty crappy leader. And then he comes home and he kills a bunch of other people, right? Like his death toll is over 708 people. Like he's a mass killer, right?
Wow, I never added it up.
Yeah, I get kind of obsessed with these things, right? Because the heroes, they're supposed to be like Platonic dialogues, right? They're supposed to prompt thought and sort of engagement in how to live life. They're not paradigms to follow. Right. And so I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of modern popular responses, is that part of what's actually going on in the Iliad and the Odyssey is they're showing how if you just follow the simple scripts and paradigms you're offered, real life doesn't actually respond to all of that and have and stories don't have all the answers. So in the Iliad, we find Achilles, playing the lyre and singing the Clea Androne, trying to figure out what story he's in, like what myth actually gives him information. None of them do. And Odysseus, and so this may seem a little too mystical. At the end of the Odyssey, I think when he's sent in search of a land where they don't recognize an oar, they mistake it for a winnowing fan. He's sent to a place with different grammar, with different rules, with different stories. Right? The Iliad, the epic, is imagining a world beyond the reach of epic. And so I think part of what's going on in Greek myth making is it acknowledges that too often we misunderstand the story and get it wrong. And this, in fact, is in part why Plato in the Republic says maybe we can't have all these poets telling these stories. And it's not that stories are bad. Socrates says most people are too stupid to understand its allegory, and you shouldn't take it literally. Which is an elitist stance, right? I don't agree. I think people aren't that stupid. We just don't teach them about how story works.
Yeah, I guess you could say, to sort of surmise, it's descriptive rather than prescriptive. That the life of the ancients would have been filled with warfare and murder and all that
Yeah.
the horrific stuff that happens in the book. And to us now, it seems very distant, and it doesn't have that rawness. Hopefully, for a lot of our readers, I'm
Yeah.
sure for some it does. Sadly, but I
Yeah.
mean, it would be war affects, fortunately, this day much less people than it did for the percentage of the population then.
Yeah, no, it does, and I think that's a significant part of the problem is our distance from the actions. I was giving a talk the other day to a retirement community and talking about some of this, but story, and someone brought up the issue of trigger warnings, which often get rejected by people out of hand. But I think about it this way: when we read a story, or you and I read a story, our experience of the story is going to be different because we don't actually like resuscitate the author's mind. Instead, we create a blend between the information we get on the page and our own experiences. If you and I are reading about a war where someone's stabbed and none of us have been around violence, it's not going to be that upsetting, right? But if we've seen someone harmed, or we've been stabbed, or we've like had someone in our family who's been murdered in that way, like that combination gives us a different response to the narrative. And especially with traumatic events, sexual assault, or actual or other types of assault, if we ask people to read something, like they are recreating it even if they don't want to. And so I think that's an important part of story to understand, is it's never just the story. It's always your experiences combining with the story and creating something new. And it's unpredictable.
Just to give a perfect example of that, if I may, I was
Yeah.
talking to the translator Diane Raja, and she does beautiful work with plays, and so
Yeah.
she works with the theater and everything like that, and she did one on Antigone, and I'm of course a big fan of Antigone, but of course from my perspective of like a young woman sort of standing up between her principles and the religion and the state and that kind of dynamic. And she was saying that she had gotten so many responses from Syrian refugees about the inability to bury your dead in war. And that
Yeah.
was their relationship with Antigone. And I was like, oh, wow, I never even thought of Antigone in that way because, of course, I haven't had that experience. But I mean, obviously, the devastation of not being able to properly mourn your dead because of wartime circumstances is such a profound feeling.
Yeah. So there's a whole field of study about what's called either unresolved or complicated grief. And then when we, cognitively, we're always trying to bring a closure to things, to end to stories. We're always anticipating outcomes or imposing them. When somebody disappears, or when we can't complete a process like a burial process, it has a different social, emotional, and even biological effect on us. Things get worse and it becomes traumatizing. But again, as you're saying rightly, it's so connected to your experience, right? The story I always tell about to illustrate this for people from my life is my relationship with the Odyssey. I didn't love the Odyssey for years. I didn't understand, especially Odysseus's reunion with his father in book 24. And what changed for me is my father died suddenly at age 61. And in the same 18-month period, my wife and I had two children. I suddenly realized, oh, wait, like you don't really understand the Odyssey unless you're a parent and a child, unless you've experienced loss in some way or another, right? And that, so it's so critical then. And so for me, this is part of the larger idea that stories are part of what I call narrative ecosystems, right? We are, in a way, story's host. It's we are where story lives. And each story will activate different things in us. And when we retell or when we contribute to the world's narrative commonwealth, like we are activating in part what we responded to. And I think this is to go to something much less like serious. I think this is in part why if you love a book, there's no way a movie version of it will ever satisfy you. Because when you're reading a book and someone's sitting in a room drinking coffee, right? Most people aren't visualizing every part of the room, like the decorations, all the shapes. But when you put it in film, you have to disambiguate all those things and give people an image. And that's jarring for us if we've just imagined parts of it. And so it's so hard because you're jumping from your vision or partial one to somebody else's. And it feels wrong, right?
I would say, with the one exception of Fight Club, where Brad Pitt made all the difference. I don't know. I just
That's fair. No. Sometimes it can be better, right? But also, Chuck Palahniuk is, in that class of writers I think of as being more like screenwriters than like common novelists. Like if you
yeah,
read his book, or Dan Brown's another one, like there's minimal writerly work going on there. It's
yeah.
all plotting, right? And so I think books like that tend to translate better into film than say Don DeLillo or one of the modernists, Richard Powers or someone. Like their work is so based on, as the kids say, vibes, right, and general description and things that are more literary in a modern sense than the plotting of, say, in some of the popular novels.
I wanted to ask, though, with regards to literary devices, is it then very impacted by kind of the restraints or benefits of specific languages? I mean, to sort of take it out of
Mm.
just the Homeric world and to sort of see it in a wider context, does the form of a language really determine the possibilities of their myths?
I mean, to an extent, right? There's the hard line of a Sapir-Whorf theory, which is the idea that language dictates what you can think, right? I don't think we should think of it as language. Instead, we should think that language, story, and culture all wrapped up do limit what you're probable to think. I don't think it makes thoughts impossible. But I do think that it conditions you to see the world in a certain way and makes it improbable for certain thoughts and options to be there, right? If we're thinking, just read stuff in the 1950s about gender roles in the United States, right? Or race, right? People get upset when you change things. And it's not that different ways of living are unthinkable. It's that it's improbable for you to accept it as a possibility based on how rigid your narrative repertoire is.
I always use as an example in this situation the difference between, say, Spanish and English when something
Mm.
breaks, because in Spanish you can say se rompió, it broke itself.
Yeah,
And in
yeah.
English, you always have to have an agent. So they've done
Right, right.
tests of that where they show a video of somebody accidentally knocking over a vase, and then afterwards they show it to a Spanish speaker and an English speaker, and the English speaker will be able to tell you more about the agent, because whereas the
Yep.
Spanish speaker might just see the action.
I
that it could
I
just break
hundred yeah.
itself.
I 100% agree with you because over time you say things in a certain way. And so in that example, we center agency in a different way. And so we look for someone to blame, right? I always think like amusing from a distant perspective, but infuriating when you're in it. In the US, if you get in a car accident, we call it an accident. The word accident has no causality or agent. But the first thing everybody asks you
Who
is
did it?
whose fault was it?
Yeah.
Right? Who's to blame? Right? Those two things are not reconcilable, right? I mean, and what it's connected to in part, of course, is like we want to charge someone for it. Right? Insurance companies want to blame someone, law does. But it is almost a toxic type of responsibility, right? Because it leaves out the idea that maybe there are more complicated causes.
To move on a little bit because I don't want to. I know I've got to be careful and use your generous time. But I'd love to just talk a little bit about AI because and this is something I think you did really well in your book. It's something that we find very important in classical wisdom is taking these big ideas in philosophy and literature and myth and everything and applying them in our modern life to sort of show that they're still relevant. So how does generative AI play in this evolution of myth and narrative?
Well, so many people will hate this answer, but I think generative AI is a dead end. And I think what it does is it gives us the appearance of a continuation and creation of stories without actually doing anything new, right? On a very basic level, I think it's an interesting analogy for stories and language, because all stories and language rely on a common store of things, right? And we're all let's use AI language for us. We're trained on language and story from a young age. And so we feed out language and story in a way that is analogical to what happens with generative AI. The difference is because generative AI, whether it's images or language, is spitting out things that are familiar to us, we are making the category error of thinking that there's intention and design behind it. It's just following patterns that are extant already in human language and narrative and art and spitting back like really kind of milk toast versions of it, right? The difference with human beings is that when we act as machines that do this, is we're combining those cultural elements with our own embodied experience, right? And our own way of seeing the world. If we had supercomputers that were to create its art would have to be based on its experience and its experience of the world, whatever that would be like, and be totally foreign or different to us, right? Or different from us. We respond to the AI images and stories because we are doing the hard effort of making sense of it. Like that's what we want to do all the time. At some level, human beings are actually really generous spirits narratively because we will take really simple stories, really simple data and string it together into a narrative that makes sense. But the problem is like all this money and effort is being put in to create garbage that we're then doing the cognitive work of to try to make sense of it. And I'd be remiss not to mention as well that it's coming at an insane cost environmentally. The figures I saw last week is for ChatGPT to do one email a month. It's 17 liters of water a year, right?
Yeah.
And so like billions of liters of water are being wasted on garbage. And to me, that's a terrible mistake because the stories that will resonate with people are those that are keyed to our time and our experiences. And AI or the generative AI, the LLMs are just scraping stuff that's dead and gone, right? It's like rearranging in a way. Sorry for this visual image. Is rearranging desiccated corpses and pretending that they're alive.
Yeah, and as you pointed out before, that cognitive blending, can't occur because,
Yeah, well, it does, but we do so much more work of it, and it's just not worth it,
yeah,
right? I mean, the billions of dollars being put into AI would be much better spent in allowing individual human beings to live like creative lives and to do these things. There's this thing, with a lot of the Silicon Valley AI people, there's this idea that, well, if we have more people doing things, we're going to have more Mozarts, right? Which I think is nonsense. You need like material wealth and training and a community context to become a Mozart. You don't need to throw billions of people out there because it's just not going to work that way.
Yeah. What was that? That old imagery, the million monkeys will eventually
Yeah,
type
yeah,
out War
yeah,
and Peace
yeah.
or something like that.
No, yeah, Hamlet. They
Yeah.
may, but the fact is, yeah, I actually talk about that example in the book. The fact is, you need somebody there to recognize Hamlet. Like out of all the garbage, you need someone there to recognize Hamlet, right?
I am not going to
And
volunteer to read all the monkey writings. Okay, I'm
no,
just
no,
gonna.
no.
Okay, very last question. Very last question. And
Yeah.
as you can tell, I could probably talk to you for hours about this. But you've been sort of talking about before about the control that we have over myth or the lack thereof.
Mm.
Um, Considering what control there is, perhaps, are there ethical responsibilities of storytellers, given that sort of the power that they do have?
It's a good question. I haven't thought about it on an individual level. I think probably there are, and I think it would be to first understand the impact that you can have on audiences, and then as you make your choices, understand that just because you want a story to be received in a way, it doesn't mean it will be. Right. So think about what you let out into the world with care and make sure that it matters. I think we can't, stories have to be entertaining or else people aren't going to listen to them. Right. But I think, what does your story, what does your creation bring to the world is something I think people should be thinking of. And we're not always encouraged to do that.
Do you think maybe also with regards to what narratives that we think are true, like
Mm.
don't repost until you fact check kind of thing?
Yeah, I know, absolutely. Well, so that's the thing. I mean, I end the book sort of not that strongly and starting to say, well, how do we act in the world if we know these things? And I think the number one thing is to actually think more about how we educate people about how narrative shapes them. And then it's also about sort of narrative literacy, understanding how narrative works and being able to decode it. And then, as you say, like if you're going to be a handmaiden to somebody else's conspiracy, like think about it first, like what's it doing, what's the impact, and where does it come from. But just in our rush to technology, right, and to STEM, even STEAM with the arts, we need to think more about how even that framework is a narrative, how science and the way we adopt it, the way we go about studying the world is also subject to a type of narrative framing, and that narrative language are prior to all human activities. And if we don't understand how they work, and if we don't educate people about how they, we're always going to be subject to people and to systems that have a stronger control of them than we do.
So teach your kids the ethics. That's, I think, the takeaway I got
yeah,
there.
yeah. I mean, I'm not going to say this, but yeah, everyone should read Homer. That's the solution. I'm not quite sure that we're doing any good, but we do need like a much broader and deeper engagement with narrative at younger ages. I think just to be able to armor ourselves against all the information we have online. I mean, individual people are exposed to more information and more narratives now than at any point in human history. And I don't think we've been asking loudly enough the question of whether our brains are ready for it.
Yeah, and there are traditions and narratives that can be they're not filtered because there can be
Mm.
so much noise. You don't know which traditions have a long standing. Like some of the
Mm.
times it's nice to read stuff that I used to have a rule. I would only read something that was at least 100 years old because that would just cut out a lot of rubbish to be
Yeah,
frank.
yeah, it would. No, it totally would.
But it's amazing. I was out in the countryside for New Year's, and down here in the Southern Hemisphere we have just you get to see much more of the Milky Way, and we're out in the middle
Hmm.
of the Pampas, and you have different constellations as well. But even
Yeah,
the
yeah.
ones that I recognize, they're upside down and whatnot, upside down. And it was like, I grew up learning the stories of the constellations. I couldn't remember any of them. And I was thinking, it's what a shame. Like, we don't
Yeah.
look up and see the stars, and we don't have any stories to tell them about them either. So it's definitely one of those things that you think there are some narratives we really need to reintroduce um,
Yeah.
into the
No, I,
world.
I agree. I mean, because it's again seeing yourself as part of something greater, like, and also feeling that, inexorable march of time. And I think, one of the dangers of our current age is because we are so separated from the natural world, we don't see ourselves as being responsible to it and subject to it, and that's having a negative effect, right?
Well, I think that's a good spot to stop and say thank you, Joel, so much for your time
Thank you.
and for your interesting book, Storylife. Always thought provocative to read your work, and I will make sure to include links so everyone can read it for
Okay.
themselves and really truly understand narrative and myth in a new way.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.